everybody who's in the market for buying a new 4000 series graphics card should probably watch this video first before purchasing one, because Nvidia's 4000 series, as of right now, has a huge problem. And I'm not talking about driver issues and bugs or the 12-pin catching fire. It's something that directly affects everybody who's buying these GPUs, but we'll get into that in a minute. First, let's look at the 4070 Ti that Nvidia just launched and why everybody hates it on the internet. Let's look at the specs of it. They upped the CUDA cores from both the 3070 and 3070 Ti's 5888 and 6144 respectively to a whopping 7680 CUDA cores, which doesn't sound that bad. The clock speeds also look pretty promising at 2.31 GHz base and 2.61 GHz boost. So why is everybody bashing this card so much? Nvidia's 4070 Ti has all of their new goodies and technologies like 3rd gen ray tracing cores, 4th gen tensor cores, and DLSS 3.0, which, by the way, they didn't shy away exactly from using in their slides, at least in some of the benchmarks. I mean, it's not super uncommon that you should take the benchmarks that these companies give you with a grain of salt, but you should get called out for that. Now, what is a first with any 70 class GPU, since basically Pascal, is that they equip this graphics card with 12 GB of VRAM, so faster memory and more memory. But then we take a look at the memory bit bus that it's connected to, and suddenly you can see how Nvidia tried to segment this card and its performance, because it's only running this 12 GB of fast memory through a 192-bit bus. So how is this a problem? Now, for those who don't know how the memory bus influences the architecture of a card, we're going to simplify this by a lot. And the cats are doing it. The total memory bandwidth that a graphics card has is basically determined by the VRAM clock multiplied by the memory bus. So the wider the memory bus is, the more data can be transferred at a time. But the memory bus also has a direct influence on how much VRAM you can actually put onto a card, because each GDDR memory chip is connected through a 32-bit wide bus. So with 192-bit, you can either connect 6 1GB chips or 6 2GB chips, just like Nvidia did on their, say, RTX 3060 12GB model, or their 3060 Ti used a 256-bit wide bus. Now, just judging it by the memory bus, the card would actually slide in somewhere between a 3060 and 3060 Ti. But the stark difference between the 4070 Ti and the 3060 is obviously the CUDA core count, which sits well above the 3070 Ti's CUDA core count. With that in mind, I hope you can see how people went totally crazy when Nvidia announced this GPU with a 192-bit wide bus as a 4080 12GB, while being nowhere near the specs of the actual 4080 16GB model. So this card should have never even been considered to be called a 4080, because releasing a card with 20% less CUDA cores and a 25% narrower memory bit bus, while only differentiating these two cards by the 12 or 16 gig naming, that is straight up misleading your customers. Not that Nvidia does this the first time, right? Because while Nvidia tries to convince us that this card offers 2 to 3 times the performance of a 3080, I clearly doubt that. And it doesn't take much digging. You just have to take a look at a few benchmarks from reputable outlets like Gamers Nexus to see that this card, well, it's not double the performance of a 3080. And it only slides in somewhere between the 3080 Ti and the 3090 Ti. Sometimes beating the 3090 by a few percent and sometimes trailing it by a few percent. So at least we, the customer, won this battle by Nvidia changing the name from 4080 12 gig to 4070 Ti, right? They also slashed $100 off the price, which, I mean, that has never happened before. Neither Nvidia unlaunching a product nor them slashing the price of a product because of backlash from the community, right? Nvidia says you basically get 3090 Ti levels of performance for half the price, so it should be a no-brainer to buy this graphics card, right? Well, not really, and we're going to put things into perspective in a bit, but for that we'll first have to look at both the 3000 series and the 4000 series and their segmentation, because Nvidia changed things up this time. So let's go back 2 years and let's look at the 3000 series launch to see how Nvidia actually segmented these GPUs. Now, the 3090 was sitting only about 10 to 15% above the 3080 in performance. All of that while costing nearly double the price. So this launched at $719, while the 3090 at launch costed $1,499. So nearly double the price for, call it 15%. Already a tough sell at that point, in my opinion. And you did see that in the past 2 years because these 3080s were sold out everywhere. So then 8 months later, Nvidia launched the 3080 Ti. And with this launch, Nvidia basically made its 3090 obsolete for gamers, because the only differentiating factor between this and the 3090, besides of the cooler size, was the VRAM basically. Of course, this had a bit cut down chip as well, but only by so few CUDA cores that in real life performance, well, it didn't make a difference. This performed exactly like a 3090 as long as you didn't fill up its memory buffer of 12 GB. On the other hand, if you can actually leverage that 24 GB of VRAM, like with video editing, 3D work, or motion design, stuff like Redshift, then yeah, the 24 GB absolutely make a huge difference for you guys. But for everybody else, not really. Also, the 3090 had NVLink fingers. We gotta mention that, which, well, Nvidia killed on the 4000 cards, because even the 4090 doesn't have NVLink anymore. And this is probably also for a good reason, because not only did they cannibalize their own Halo product in the consumer spaces by launching this GPU, but they also kind of cannibalized their Quadro series lineup, because you could just buy 3090s instead of an A6000. And if you were upset about the pricing for consumer cards from Nvidia, take a look at what the server stuff costs from them, and you'll probably get a heart attack, because that is on a whole different level. And for some people who just needed more VRAM for certain applications, this was a godsend, because you could basically get 48 gigabytes of VRAM, even in the mining days, for what, $4,000? And Nvidia was also kind of sick of them cannibalizing their own product stack, because now you can see that the 4090 is actually segmented completely different. For the first time around, it is a lot faster than the 4080, just to stop this cannibalizing their own lineup of GPUs from happening. The problem right now is the price. And it's not just Nvidia's MSRP, because the whole concept of MSRP has been kind of thrown out of the window with this generation, but rather the real-life pricing these cards are selling for. Because nowadays, after the mining boom in the past 2 years and the GPU shortage, well, Nvidia resellers and their partners alike think that we, the idiot customer, will just run out and buy any GPU, no matter how overpriced it is. Well, bad news, Nvidia, we're kind of entering a recession right now, and not everybody just has a pile of money sitting around just waiting for you to launch a new GPU to throw it at you. And because obviously the mining boom and the shortage left so many 3000 series cards sitting on shelves that still have to sell, and trust me, neither Nvidia nor any add-in board partners nor the resellers who are selling them to you, the customer, want to sell these at a loss. So what is the only obvious choice then? Well, you make the 4000 series more expensive than it actually is. And this is what we saw over the past 2 months since the launch of Nvidia's 4000 series cards. These cards were nowhere near MSRP. If we look at launch pricing, and even right now, 4090s are still going for over $2,000, and 4080s at launch were selling for $1,500, easily $300 more than MSRP. The good thing is, pricing has been changing on the Nvidia side, especially since AMD came out with their new 7900 XT and XTX. They've been putting a lot of pressure on Nvidia's especially 4080 GPU, because they're performing relatively similar in non-ray traced games or non-ray traced applications in general. Nvidia has at least been forced to adjust their ludicrous $1,500 pricing on the 4080 to something a bit more sensible and closer to MSRP. So now, the good thing is, you can actually buy a 4080 16GB for roughly MSRP, maybe $50 to $100 more. At least in Europe, a 4080 will cost you about 1,300 to 1,350 euros, and in the US you can get 4080s for about $1,200 to $1,300, which isn't stellar, but definitely closer and more realistic to Nvidia's MSRP than the astronomical launch price that they were going for before, when they didn't have any competition in the market. And unless there will be competition for the 4090 series, I sadly don't see those prices coming down from the $2,000 line anytime soon. Unless, of course, nobody buys the GPUs. And don't forget, we as consumers do have a lot of power when it comes to where we put our money, because if we don't buy products, companies are forced to change something about it. With products like these that take years to engineer, well, it's the pricing in the end. So unless the 4090 is just sitting on shelves, I don't think the prices will come down anytime soon. And all of this is also kind of hinting at the fact that even 4080s weren't selling that well, at least for the prices that they were launched for. Now, if you want a true 4K gaming experience in 2023, then, well, what options do you really have? You can go out and drop $2,000 on a 4090, which will give you stellar performance. And we have to come back to this because the performance of the 40 series cards is amazing. It's not bad, right? 4090s are chart toppers in pretty much every benchmark. So the performance is there. It's just the price to performance is absolutely horrific. Very little people are in the market for buying a GPU that even costs $1,000, to say the least $2,000. So what are your other options? Now, you could go to Team Red and purchase a 7900 XT or XTX. If you can pick one up substantially cheaper than the 4080, then I think that is the way to go for. But you'll have to live with the fact that even though you're spending $1,000 or euros on a graphics card, at that point you're kind of still making compromises. So what are those compromises? Well, you hopefully won't be using Blender anytime soon, because AMD gets absolutely spanked in that application. Hopefully you're also not planning on using GPU renderers like Redshift, because its OpenGL support is absolutely poop. And obviously you'll also probably be skipping ray tracing for another few years. As for the 4070 Ti, well, it gets handily beaten by AMD's offerings, even the 7900 XT. So at that point, it kind of comes down to pricing in your region, and if you're willing to make these aforementioned compromises, it's looking like the better choice. My recommendation is look at some benchmarks that actually test the games that you are playing with these cards and make the decision for yourself. Because in some games, the performance deltas are a bit bigger, but in some games, I mean, we're talking 10 FPS, and honestly, having 160 or 175 FPS is not that big of a difference, especially considering that you can get 3080s on eBay for what, $650 as of right now? It becomes a really tough sell, and even 3080 Ti's, you can find these for $700-800. As long as the 4070 Ti is sitting around $1,000 still, or even well above $900 or euros, it's tough to recommend against these cards that you can pick up for way less money, which offer you nearly 90% of the performance that the 4070 Ti is giving you. So you can see where I'm going with this, and personally, I will definitely keep my 3080 and 3080 Ti GPUs for now, and I don't really see myself upgrading to any of the 4000 series GPUs anytime soon, unless they slash the prices.